Good evening from Los Angeles, California. My name is Charlie Coker, and I'm the director of Asia Society Southern California. Thank you for joining us tonight for the sixth in our series of COVID-19 related programming. Tonight, we will be discussing the impact of COVID-19 on the global sports world. We will be joined by Liz Habib, an Emmy award-winning journalist and sports anchor for Fox 11 in Los Angeles, as well as three owners from different global sports leagues. Before we get onto the program, I'd like to very much thank our silver sponsor, TSM, as well as our special sponsor, Peter Federman Gallery. The Federman Gallery has curated a special series of iconic photographs from the sports world, which are on sale, and the proceeds of it, partially the proceeds of which will be donated to Asia Society Southern California. So I hope you will click on the link and take a look. But without further ado, I would like to introduce our moderator for the evening, Liz Habib.
Hi, thanks, Charlie, and good evening, everybody. It's really good to be with you, or good morning, or good day, wherever you happen to be. I want to introduce our panelists, and I want to get through it really quick because there's a lot of really great stuff to talk about today. We have panelists from the NFL, the National Basketball Association, and MLS. So from the NFL, Larry Paul, who is a co-owner of the Pittsburgh Steelers, a team very dear to my heart. I grew up in Pittsburgh, as did Larry. Mark Stevens, an investor and on the executive board, one of the executive board members of the Golden State Warriors, that team that had become such a dynasty. It looked like an amazing team. And from Vietnam with us today in Major League Soccer, co-owner, vice chair of the LAFC, the Los Angeles Football Club, is Henry Nguyen. And it's good to have all of you with us this morning. And Henry, this afternoon, this evening. Henry, I want to start with you because the team, the professional team that's getting back first is getting back exactly 2 weeks from today, and that's MLS. And we found out today that LAFC is going to kick it off against the Houston Dynamo. It'll be on Fox. I work for Fox Sports 1. What does this look like? All of MLS is going to Florida. There's a little bit of an outbreak in Florida right now. What does this look like to keep the team safe and to keep the play going?
You know, like all leagues, it's been a phased approach in terms of getting back on the field and then obviously back to competition. So even our players have been doing conditioning at home drills during more of the lockdown periods. And over the last several weeks have been able to get into our facilities to train. Many of them actually still in isolation, but then now we've started team training over the last couple of weeks. But all in all, you know, it's really trying to get things restarted. So having our players, coaches, and team ready in a phased manner so that we can control as many of the variables as possible. Because quite frankly, you know, I think we're prepared at some point that there will be positive tests at all these different phases, whether it's in pre-transit phase for our team, taking our charter out to Orlando. Even after we arrive, each of the team and the players will continue to self-isolate after taking tests and making sure they're positive. And then also there's detailed protocols and precautions even after that starts. The format of how we're continuing our season is actually, I think, going to be a very exciting one. It's split up into sort of World Cup or Euro type groups. Each of those group games are going to matter in our season in terms of being officially on the record. And then from those 26 teams, we're going to be able to winnow it down to a 16-team knockout format. So not unlike you'd see at the World Cup or at the Euro championships. And so that means every game matters. And particularly for us, we're in a group where we're with three of our most ferocious Western Conference rivals. So I think it's going to be all some exciting games, even though we can't play with an audience live.
And I should mention LAFC is the favorite to win this, and that's a really big deal. Seems like a lot of the LA teams seem to be favorites as we go into some of these restarts. So good for you guys for being in that position. That must be exciting for you.
Sure, I'll always take being the favorite, or at least being in a position to win. That's always been kind of one of our big common goals as an organization. And I feel good about our team. We've been together now for 2+ seasons, and I really think we're clicking and coming together.
an amazing thing, 2+ seasons and already this far along. All right, let me move over to Mark and talk to you a little bit. The Warriors are not going to come back to play just because of the way the league has set up this return with the NBA, Mark. But tell us a little bit about, there's 113 pages of protocols for NBA players to survive in this bubble. And one of the biggest questions would be, what if one of the biggest stars, say LeBron James, test positive? Where do you go from there? Tell us about the setup and what you anticipate.
Well, yeah, it's a 113-page document that outlines the entire how how it's going to be structured in Orlando. There's 22 teams that are going to be going to Orlando. It's a play-in format for the 8th and final playoff spot in each conference, and then they'll do the regular playoffs, quarterfinals, semifinals, and finals. Yeah, and we've already had 3 players just in the last few days who have tested positive. We have Jokic. He was in, I think, Serbia, and he's quarantined for 2 weeks. And we had one of the players from the Lakers, one of the reserve guards, is just opted out because he didn't want to have his child exposed. And so, it's going to be tricky because teams might lose players along the way as the playoffs progress. And so it's going to make the playoffs a lot more unpredictable than I think they have been in the past. Normally, the one team plays the 8 team and the 2 seed plays the 7 seed. And, if the 1 seed or the 2 seed, they lose a Giannis, they lose a LeBron, that makes that series all of a sudden a lot closer. So, we're all in uncharted territories here. And, we're going to do our best to keep players from getting infected, and the coaching staffs. We have a lot of coaching staffs who are advanced in age and might be more susceptible to a serious effects of COVID. So we're trying to cover all the bases, but it's a very unpredictable situation right now.
I think if anything, that's for sure. We see it in golf. Just today, a couple more of the top golfers in the world had to pull out, not because they tested positive, but people around them tested positive. So the bubble is so important that the NBA has set up to be in. Do you think that it will be, just one of the golfers' family members tested positive? So out of an abundance of caution, he's not going to golf this weekend. Will the players and maybe their families, do you think they'll stick to the bubble?
We hope so. It's going to take a lot of discipline on the part of the players and the coaching staffs. And unfortunately, Orlando is in Florida, and Florida is experiencing a renewed outbreak just in the last few days. So we hope so. We have to keep the integrity of the bubble in place to minimize the number of potential infections. I mean, we're going to have 22 teams. If you multiply it by the number of players and coaches, we're talking about several hundred people in this bubble. And, if you have 1 or 2 people that test positive, then it's kind of all hands on deck. So.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see as we go forward. Larry, if there's one thing that the NFL has, it is 3 months. They have time on their hands. And 3 months ago, we had just started this stay at home. So 3 months from now, things can be so different. Everything with the NFL has so far gone on as scheduled, albeit, virtual off-season program, virtual draft. Where does the league stand right now in terms of, are you guys going to start on time? Are you going to invite fans to games? Where are you?
I think we had the benefit up front of great timing, serendipitous timing. I mean, we happened to sort of end our season 30 days before everything snowballed into what it's become now vis-a-vis COVID. And we've got the benefit of, from the time that happened, 6 months, and baseball, basketball, hockey, soccer, having to figure out how to reopen in front of us. We've got the benefit of figuring that out. Arena reopening is obviously very different than stadium reopening, indoor versus outdoor. I think where we sit today is, I think the league, and if you look at the draft as an example, the show will go on. It just might look different. And I think if you look at how the draft went down, they were prepared for a big extravaganza in Las Vegas, sort of the draft the world never seen before. And guess what? They got the draft the world's never seen before. It just was more fitting with the times, what was going on. And I think the ratings reflected the fact that people are starving for sports of any kind. I think where we sit today, we're very much subject to state regulations. I mean, we play across a number of different states, and governors of states have different outlooks on sort of what can reopen and when it can reopen, what's an acceptable crowd size. And so I think we're reacting on a daily and weekly basis as to what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, and what is putting people in a confined space, albeit outdoors, look like, recognizing that the last thing the NFL wants to do, what the NFL wants to do is to bring people together, not drive people apart. And so I think we're very sensitive to making sure that we do that.
MLS, and did someone have something they want to add? MLS and the NBA are playing without crowds. So the NFL is looking at playing with crowds. I found a number today that I thought was so fascinating. Indy, I suppose for their race, I don't know when they have it scheduled, has sold 175,000 tickets. That's talks to demand. I have an inside source, Larry, at the NFL, who told me that tickets on the secondary market, and it's not, this time it's not you, Larry, the tickets on the secondary market are up 20%. So the demand, these are people, we don't even know if you can go to games, but people are buying tickets. The demand for sports is so clear. Ticket sales in Los Angeles are through the roof for SoFi, Larry. So if you can fit, I don't know, 50,000 in a stadium, how many do you think you would invite to a game and be safe?
Well, so I think hope springs eternal for sort of wanting to be able to watch sports live. And I think it's the NFL has every intention of making sure that as a league, we are there to make sure that people have content that they can watch on Thursday, on Sunday, on Monday, because it's directionally where we want to go. But if you look right now, and the league has come out with a tiering of sort of who can be around players in conjunction with the NFL Players Association. I think right now we're capped at 215 people that can be around players for the league, and Pennsylvania is capping us at 250 for the governor. So it's awfully hard to have a live action fan based game with 250 fans in the stadium. Something's going to move, and I think we're waiting to sort of see what does that look like. I think if you have to go to a fanless stadium, and I think a lot of people certainly expect the opening portion of the season to be fanless in most venues. Again, not governor based and state based. I think that it will take some getting used to. I mean, folks that I've talked to have said, gee, suddenly calling plays in the huddle, we might have to back up an extra 4 or 5 yards and talk in a whisper because the defensive lineman can hear our play calling. Which, I mean, things you don't think about when there's crowd noise. There's been some discussion about you pipe in crowd noise. But remember, for a lot of these guys playing in training camp historically or their off-season workouts, they're playing with no crowd noise. I mean, they're running offense versus defense with no crowd noise. So it may be a little weird. And then I think where the network will come in is sort of go, gee, what does the broadcast look like? Can you broadcast differently? Can you do more aerial views of the field? Can you do more, kind of what they call kind of the all 22, and what does that look like? Can you do more stuff from the sidelines? And can you rethink how you broadcast the game if you can't hand to some group of fans going crazy when something happens on the field?
Yeah, it changes the role of television. Henry, MLS, because you're coming out before everyone else, in 2 weeks, really can get an advantage or new eyes on the product. So in preparation for new eyes on the product, what are you looking at as a team in a league?
No, I think, look, as Larry and both Mark had mentioned, I think there's such a pent-up demand for just live sports that, ESPN itself is taken up to broadcasting Korean baseball or any other sporting event that they can. And so we have an opportunity, again, to kind of have a couple of weeks where we really can showcase our game. I think people will kind of awake to the sort of the excitement of this tournament format that we have. And I think particularly our core fans, what we wanted to do when we restarted is to make sure that every game mattered. And for sure, I think the way we've set this up, it will. And there will be excitement despite there not being that live crowd atmosphere, and particularly in soccer where that's so important in terms of just the chanting and the flow and the momentum. So I think it will be something that is a broadcast challenge that Larry's mentioned. I know both ESPN and Fox are working on, ideas in terms of whether, miking up and that we can really have sounds of the game quite clearly to making sure that there is some crowd noise or at least even having, opportunities to have sponsorship placards in empty seats. And that's something, again, I think that's very important for us to make sure we can create some dynamism in all of these games.
Yeah, and Liz, I think you're also seeing that a number of the leagues are. I mean, I've seen experiments with virtual fans, and can you in the same way that they would have fans as a backdrop to the draft from their homes celebrating when somebody was picked, and you put virtual fans in the stadium and sort of make your at-home experience. So you could be a fan and you could see yourself in the stadium. They're experimenting with all sorts of things to figure out. If you're yelling at home, can that be transmitted across the broadcast or into the stadium? And I think they're playing with all those things right now.
I think the interesting thing is going to be in September and October, we're going to have this big crush because you're going to have the NBA going on, the playoffs. You're going to have MLS. You're going to have college football, maybe, and you'll have the NFL, and you'll have baseball.
And golf.
And golf. So, yeah, I don't know. There's enough channels to handle all this content. I mean, it's going to be, it's never happened before. You know, there's always been a very careful sequence of when the NFL ends and when the NBA ends and when another sport starts. So, there's a tremendous demand for broadcast sports, obviously, but I think there's going to be fans that are going to be watching 24/7, and especially in September and October.
I think the one nice thing as well is for the networks is there's so little appointment TV anymore. I mean, you can put it on your DVR and watch it. Live sports is one of the exceptions to the rule, because unless you're a really avid fan, once you know the outcome, you're done. And so I think the network, will make part of a very wide swath for live sports to come back under the theory of live viewership is invaluable to them for advertising and things like that.
You know, Mark, I should have mentioned in the beginning that you were on the board of trustees at USC, University of Southern California, and you just mentioned college football. And when we in the media, we really approach the pro sports first, because kind of where the pros go is what we think will happen. But college is a little bit more of a tentative situation. They're allowing players now back on campus to begin practicing. What do you think is going to happen in terms of the college game, football, all sports, as a matter of fact?
Yeah. So, you know, college football is, scheduled to start Labor Day weekend. So it's about a week before the NFL season. You know, the Pac-12 is allowing student athletes back on campus this past week. The other Power 5 conferences have done it a little bit earlier. So we're proceeding along that there'll be football in the fall. The economics of college sports almost mandates there has to be football, because football pays for all of the other varsity sports in America. And so everybody wants to have football. USC just a few days ago put out a note to season ticket holders that allowing season ticket holders to opt out if they'd like. You know, the new Coliseum has 77,000 seats. There could be a scenario where they only fill 10 or 15,000 seats to keep 6-foot distancing between seats or between rows. So that's been discussed. But again, nobody really knows. You know, you know, each of the Power 5 conferences, you know, obviously span different states, and each state has their own rules. And so in the Pac-12, if California goes back to a shelter in place, does that mean that the 4 California Pac-12 schools have to not play? There's been talk of not having non-conference games and just doing conference schedules. Well, how does that, you know, if you're USC, that means you don't play Notre Dame at the end of the season. So a lot of questions still about college sports. Bowdoin College, which is a small college up in New England, the Division III school, announced today they've canceled all fall sports until January 1st. And so there's a lot of the smaller schools, the non-Power 5 schools, who are on tremendous financial pressure right now because they didn't get their basketball revenues from March Madness. And so you're seeing, I was talking to the one of the athletic directors in the West Coast Conference the other day, and she, you know, she's worried that they're going to have to sacrifice some varsity sports for the next couple of years because they just don't have the revenue coming in from things like basketball. So it's going to be interesting.
So I think Liz is having some technical issues. So why don't we just go to a couple of questions that have come up already. So this is for Larry and Henry. The fact that both of you trained as physicians, has this influenced your view has this influenced the views among other fellow owners in terms of whether and how your teams resume practicing and playing? Have you brought your medical training and expertise to bear in those discussions? Maybe Henry, you can start.
Sure. No, look, it helps obviously to have some medical training and understanding, particularly in times like this. One is to provide some assurance in terms of what we know and what we don't know, and to be able to delineate kind of the known knowns or the known unknowns. But I think beyond that, what really has been a revolution in sports over the past couple decades is that, conditioning, both mental and physical health for athletes have come to the fore. And I think for all of the leagues, whether it's NFL, MLS, NBA, a lot more most safety importance is individual health and safety. Obviously, starting with the players, the coaches, all of our staff, and then of course all of our fans. And that means making some tough choices. That means coming up with detailed protocols to make sure that we can ensure the greatest amount of safety, given, again, all the different risks that come with our sports. You have a high contact level sports like basketball or football, which come with a certain set of issues. And you have sort of maybe sports like baseball that have less contact, but have other issues that relate to sort of transmissibility and things that can make it more or less risky when it comes to COVID. But yeah, I think all of our backgrounds kind of come to the forefront, whether it could be in healthcare or finance or operations in times like this. And it has been useful, and I'm glad sort of I have that. I'm sure Larry feels the same.
Yeah, I think on our end, honestly, I think common sense prevails here. I'm not sure what I learned in medical school brings a lot to bear, other than I kind of understand at a medical level kind of what's going on. But I think look, the NFL has put player safety front and center for a number of years now. I don't think the other leagues are looking at it any differently. I think the NFL Players Association will make sure player safety and health safety is important. You have some very close, in any sport, you have families and loved ones around these players. You have a lot of young kids around these players. You have a lot of parents around these players. And you just want to make sure that you do everything you can to keep your players safe and healthy. But you also recognize you live in the real world, and players do go home, and we're not going to keep them in a bubble. And therefore, I would anticipate they're going to be checked a lot. And frequently as they come in and out of the facility. But I think my medical background specifically, I think it brings to bear just a lot of information, which in a different version is sort of out there in the public press and being discussed regularly.
Thank you. So Mark, I was wondering, I know we're waiting for Liz to kind of come back on, but what has the NBA learned from this and the sports world kind of learned from what's been going on already with respect to the Korean and Taiwanese leagues, as well as the soccer leagues in Europe that have already started to play again? Have there any been lessons that the Golden State Warriors, or you think the NBA has gleaned from that?
Well, I think they've learned that when you have a player, or somebody in the organization that tests positive, you immediately have to, isolate that person and do the contact tracing. And I think, again, in places like Korea, they've done a great job of contact tracing. I think in the U.S., we have not done a great job with that. We're not set up to do that. And I think as sports reopen up in the U.S., it could be a problem. We could really, not know certain players or coaches or staff people who, might have been exposed or infected, and without the using technology, we may not be able to isolate these folks. So the NBA is, we've watched, Korean baseball reopen up and some, things in Asia open up. But this 113-page report that Liz referred to earlier, a lot of the protocols and that are in that document, were learnings that we saw from Asia. So
another follow-up question with respect to everyone here is that, obviously the impact of not having a crowd around and the energy that the players get from the crowd. And, there have been, some basketball players who talked about that, some very prominent basketball players out there. So, how do you think your respective sports are going to deal with that whole aspect? And I think, Larry, you alluded to that earlier about maybe even having to move the huddle back and to have and addressing not having an audience or not having sports fans in the arena. How will that work as far as, with the intensity of the players? How will that affect performance, do you think? So Larry, maybe I could go to you first.
Yeah. What I would tell you is these players are first and foremost competitors. They're out there. They want to win. When they go into training camp, lots of the practice sessions are closed to the public, and they're fighting just as hard against each other in training camp. The idea that they need a crowd to sort of give them reason to win, I think the game is enough reason for them to win. Will it take some degree of adjustment? Absolutely. I don't think anybody expects it to be normal, but I think kind of once players adjust and teams adjust to sort of the new normal, I don't see any diminution of the competitiveness of the game, because ultimately these are type A competitive men who, and women on the coaching staff who are just want to win, as much as they can. And whether there's a crowd to feed off of or not, they feed off of each other. I think that's apparent if you just watch the games televised. Players absolutely feed off of each other, and so I think that degree of intensity will be there whether there's people in the stands or not.
Yeah, I agree with Larry. In the NBA, as we do the playoffs in Orlando, every game's a neutral site game essentially, right? And so it'll be interesting. There are certain arenas in the NBA that are louder than others, and there's fans that are sort of more vociferous than in some arenas, and so that kind of goes away when you've got no crowd, and so you truly have teams that would normally have a tilt towards a stronger home court advantage. Obviously, that would not be there with no fans in the stands.
Yeah, I'll just add. I think the professionalism and the competitiveness of the players, there's no doubt it's there. But I think all of us, if we had a choice, we'd prefer to host a playoff game or a regular season game. And I think, again, it's because of the passion of the fans. It creates an atmosphere. I think that's unbeatable. What we tried to build at our stadium, at the Bank of California Stadium, is a real home field advantage. And that's both the hardware and the software in terms of not only just how our fans, particularly our supporter section who are standing and cheering all game, creating sort of a kind of energy, but even in the hardware in terms of how we built a roof that reflects the sound and kind of creates this real tight sound box. And I think all of us try to find one way or another to generate some home field advantage. And I think that a little bit of that will be lost, but I think in the end, the players are professionals. They'll dig down deep when they need to, but I'm sure they'll miss a little bit of that passion or energy.
Well, I think Liz is back with us, so I will turn it back over to her.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I was in the middle of giving you guys a number. I don't know how much of it that you heard, but I was hoping that you did. You didn't hear much of it. Okay, here's the deal. Of the about 1,800 players in the Premier League, since mid-May, they've been tested 12,057 times, and they've only had 18 positives out of that testing. I just want to hear you react to that and what you think of that number. Larry, can you start that?
Well, I think the aggressive testing is essential, because I think players want to know if they're on the field, that people they're on the field with are safe. I think the question is, what do you do with that? I mean, if you now have to contact trace, does that mean everybody that was in the huddle with that player that day is now on the sidelines for 14 days? Again, I think that's a medical question, hasn't been addressed. So I'm relieved to hear the numbers are as small as they are, and clearly much smaller than what you would get from the national numbers that are posted out of Hopkins. But I think that the Players Association, in conjunction with the league, is going to have to figure out, what is it? Is it the equivalent of concussion protocol, where if you test positive, you're out next week? And is everybody else you came in contact with out next week? Because we're creating these sort of layers of bubble. All these players are inside a bubble together. And so I think the idea that if player 1 tests positive, he hasn't come in contact with player 53, you have team meetings, you have offense and defense, you have whole team meetings, you have position meetings with coaches. So it's not like inside that bubble there's a way to put plexiglass between people. So I'm not exactly sure where it goes, but I'm relieved to hear the numbers are low. I don't know the approach they take if a player gets sick during the season, but I'm guessing it's going to have to be a similar sort of protocol.
Yeah, Henry, what did you think of that when you heard those numbers?
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't heard those numbers before, and when I hear them, actually, it's surprising, because obviously, look, these tests are not perfect. There are error rates to this in terms of their specificity. So what percentage of even these positive cases are true positives? I mean, this is where, the work of researchers and epidemiologists, as we continue to understand all of this better, is very important. A positive test is a positive test when you're talking about the PCR test, but you have to see if a player is symptomatic. You have to then follow and basically isolate that person to see if they do continue to develop symptoms that are correlated with COVID. And of course, I think both Mark and Larry have talked about contact tracing and even quarantine for those, primary, secondary, and even tertiary levels of contact. We still don't know enough about transmissibility, but when you're talking numbers that low, I mean, those numbers could even just be within the false positive rates. So it's a difficult, thing to manage, no doubt, but I think you always have to err on the side of safety.
I don't know if we got to this question, Mark, while I had my Wi-Fi issue there, but there's someone asking right on the conference here that has college talked about revenue sharing? Has the Pac-12 talked about revenue sharing? Now, to be clear, the TV contract from the Pac-12 does share among the schools, correct? And so is there any way to kind of mitigate the loss of money schools are facing?
Well, I mean, the college football, they have the contract, the revenue with the networks. In this case, it's Fox, your network, and ESPN and CBS. And then you have the gate ticket revenue. And I mean, they're both very, those are the two largest revenue components to college football. And as I understand it, all of the Power 5 conferences do revenue share, the TV money. Obviously, each school keeps their own, gate revenue money, but all the conferences do revenue share. So even if you had a scenario where there were no fans in the stands this fall, you could still put the games on TV, and the Power 5 schools would share in the revenue of those TV contracts. So, but it would still, without fans in the stands, it still creates a huge budget hole for all of these conferences.
And guys, you guys could probably talk to this. All of these TV contracts are already set in stone, right? So you are right, there's going to be a whole bunch of sports at one time. But if, say, tons of people are watching soccer and the ratings are so great, Henry, and this is a bigger number than ever before, it can't be renegotiated, can it? You're kind of stuck right now where you are.
Well, look, it's two-sided. Our partners, our media partners, we signed an agreement. We made a deal. We have to try to live up to it. That means being able to put on the number of games that are required. And there's so many other dependencies, too, in terms of even our sponsors and other partners. So, I think both sides are trying their best to really make the best out of the situation. And I think, frankly, a lot of that is what's driving us to figure out how to make this all work. Because in the end, yes, we want sports kind of as a general concept, but we also run businesses. And as businesses, like every other business that's been affected by this, we have to find a way to continue to move forward in a way that's prudent, that's safe, and that fulfills again all of the obligations we have to our different partners, media and otherwise.
You know, Larry, if I don't want to ignore Black Lives Matter and the movement, because even as we come back with coronavirus and try to get back on the field, now we have another issue in all sports leagues. The Premier League has picked up the Black Lives Matter movement. In the NFL, it's been sensitive in the past with kneeling during the national anthem. So a lot of eyes on the NFL and a lot of proactive players out there right now. We've seen Roger Goodell shift his position and the league position. Can you address that a little bit as we come into such an unusual season to begin with? Now we have the movement of Black Lives Matter.
Well, look, I think same set of facts, different place and time creates a different moment. And I think we're at a different place in time. I think if you go back 2 years, the players that were kneeling, and they were down to a very small number. I think by the time the comments were made by the president about it being an insult to patriotism, they were down to, I think that week it was 9 or 10 players out of 1,700 that were kneeling. And I think if you go back and you look at sort of the discussions with Colin Kaepernick, he'll tell you that it wasn't about patriotism. It was about racial equality and addressing racial equality at a time where lots of eyes were on the game and calling attention to it. And I'm going to stay out of sort of the who was right, who was wrong then. I think what's very clear now in the signals that have been sent very clearly, players came out and asked the NFL to sort of make a statement, and Roger made the statement verbatim back to the players and made that commitment. I think in our locker room, Mike Tomlin has specifically said that he will be right there with the players if they kneel. If it's part of bringing the team together, the issue is very important. It is a national issue right now that needs to be addressed. And I think you can expect the NFL, to understand that it will be front and center with regard to how it reacts. And I think, I could be wrong, but I think 28 to 30 or 31 of the teams are all on the record at this point being in favor of doing so. So I think there's a lot of unanimity now. Didn't exist 2 or 3 years ago.
To make it very clear, when a game is broadcast on television, unless it's the Super Bowl, not typically do we broadcast the national anthem. So I don't know what changes might come this year with this, and I haven't heard anything, at least not from our network. In the Premier League, the players wearing Black Lives Matter. This is part of a question, Black Lives Matter in lieu of names and teams, and they're going to wear a patch all season long. So Larry, you talked a little bit about the NFL. Mark, the players in the NBA, led by one of the most famous players in the world, LeBron James, will have already had lots to say. In fact, Mark, some of the players have said they'd rather not play. They'd rather not come back because they want to focus more on this moment in time and making a difference. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, we've had a few. I mean, I think Dwight Howard came out and said that, and a few other players did. And I think they're it's important they say that, and that they're upfront about that. That they feel that this movement is greater than the game of basketball. It's greater than sports, and it is, right? I mean, this issue of social equality in our society is a bigger cause or a bigger issue than sports. And so the fact that they've come out and said that, I think is admirable. I think we'd like to have all the players there in Orlando playing. But if their conscience says to them that this movement is more important to them, then they should have that choice.
Yeah, in fact, Adam Silver said that he said if players don't want to come back, right, he respects that, and that's fine, and that's the way the league is handling that going forward. Steve Kerr, the coach of the Warriors, is very outspoken and a leader sort of in this area with his players. You've noticed that, right? Yeah. What do you think of how he handles it?
I think Steve's done a great job. He's handled it. He's outspoken, but Steve is very thoughtful of when he takes positions around this issue, and he's a very mature, experienced voice. In the coaching ranks in the NBA, he was, as you know, a one-time broadcaster. So, he's been around the league forever as a player, a broadcaster, now as a coach. And so he has I think, a unique perspective on this topic. And he's been active in the local community here in the Bay Area on this issue. Recently, he spoke out in Oakland around the issue of do we have police on school campuses, and so he's done a great job of speaking out and being very thoughtful about it.
Henry, I haven't seen much from the MLS players in terms of how they want to support the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests. Can you comment on that?
Well, look, maybe I'll commentate on it more globally. Obviously soccer is the most popular sport in the world, and obviously in Europe it reigns supreme, but it also has a very, very ugly history of racism in Europe, particularly recently in Italy or even the UK. So this is why I think this movement has caught on so strongly with Premier League teams, Bundesliga teams, and other European football clubs, because this is something that Black players actually face real abuse even when they're on the court, even when they're on the field. So I think this really is a global movement, and when it comes to sports. As it relates to MLS, we have many players who've come out in support, obviously, of the movement. But the MLS in and of itself, I think, is like a lot of the other leagues. We've come into this, one of our very famous kind of slogans is "Soccer is for all," and I think we mean that's for every race, creed, gender, color, etc. And I think that's, again, the importance of sports is that expression of values, that symbolism. Sometimes it's just a game, but I think in moments like this, it's definitely more than a game. All eyes are on these players. They are people that young people and fans look up to, and I think this is a pivotal moment in that athletes and their voices, they matter, and I think it's exciting, because I think it really creates greater diversity and opportunity for more voices to be heard in our society.
You are right about the European leagues, the discrimination and the ugly racism that players have faced.
Yeah.
And some of the European leagues, it would be nice to see a change happen there. So now let's go to this topic, sort of the psychology of sports, where you just went, right? So not only we see sports take over in the biggest moments of the world and make people feel a sense of unity, right? The Olympics, Mark, you're on the, is it
I'm on the U.S. Olympic Foundation board.
Okay, so the Olympics is ultimately the big thing that we all look at, and that's psychology, right? We can look back to a World Series in 2001 when the president walked out onto the mound, right, George Bush, and threw the ball out, and this sense of unity that people feel. If ever there was a time that we needed a comeback and a sense of unity and that feeling that sports can give you, it's now. And Henry, you and I were talking that, it's just sports, but then again, it's just sports. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, look, it's a game, right? But all of us, I think, are in this business, and we know it's more than a game, and we know it can have profound meaning if we approach it the right way, and we live with it with the right set of values. And that's kind of why I think all of us are even on this panel and have had a career that relates to sports so deeply, because it means something, right? For human beings, kind of, we do everything we do in the world to make a living, to taking care of our families. But in the end, one of the great expressions of creativity and drama and storytelling is sports. So in a certain way, sports is one of our highest cultural pursuits. And I deeply feel that. And we all know this. It is about togetherness, especially in times like this where we are isolated. We've all gone through different forms of stay-at-home orders or lockdowns, and losing that togetherness, that human touch, is losing a certain kind of humanness. And to Larry and Mark's point, which is we need that sort of campfire event, that thing that we're all leaning in and saying, sharing this emotional transportation together in that moment. So, today we can't necessarily be in the stadium, but what's beautiful is obviously the development of all the technology and media we have to share these moments together, even remotely, and is still sharing something. So Olympics, World Cup, Super Bowls, World Series, NBA championships. This, I think we're going to discover that people just have so much pent up demand to share these type of emotions and feelings together again.
Yeah.
I think as well, Liz. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, we've all watched everything you can on Netflix and Amazon and TV, and the idea that you have G and PG rated entertainment that you can watch cross generationally, you can watch with your kids, you can watch with your parents, and it's live. I mean, it's a unifying force, which I think everybody's so desperately in need of right now, given, you know, I think people are just anxious to sort of have even a momentary return to normalcy, kind of the way they remember normalcy. And even that only lasts for 3 hours, it still provides a safe haven and a happy place and comfort food for the soul kind of thing as a place to go.
And Mark, I can picture it now because I know how I work to cover things, that we will look for not only the comeback, and we can't wait to see the big stars of the NBA back out there, but what else we'll be looking for is how are the big stars of the NBA getting their messages across and using their platforms in all of this. And I'm sure the league is prepared for that. I heard Adam Silver say, look, you're going to get a lot of attention. You got to show up. What do you think, Mark?
Yeah, no, I think that, you know, when the NBA does come back and we have the playoffs in the fall, you know, it's going to be a huge audience, and it's going to give the players that much more, you know, of a platform to project their, you know, their opinions about the situation of the world. So I think it's, you know, the NBA playoffs are always a big platform for players, but I think this year it's even going to be more express. And then, you know, I look 13 months from now, the Olympics in Tokyo, you know, that's going to be a very special Olympics. And I think that will be an Olympics that more than the several past Olympics will really draw the world together, because the entire world has experienced COVID, and hopefully it's an event that really brings the world together in a special way.
What a great point you make right there. Yeah, that's a create world unity. Something that's an interesting point, because we're all over the world sitting right now on Zoom and doing this type. So this sort of this feeling out there. The Olympic Committee, do you know anything about what might be planned since it's been postponed for a year, or what's different? Do you know anything about it?
Well, you know, I don't have insight into what the IOC is thinking. I mean, they've said that the opening day will be 1 year exactly from what the date was supposed to be this year in July. The USOC, the Colorado Springs training facility is due to reopen up, I think, next week. And so you know, the athletes will kind of restart their training regimens as we get into August. And hopefully these facilities don't get, you know, shut down again because of outbreaks. And the interesting thing is, you know, there's only going to be about, I think, 150 or 160 days between the end of the Tokyo Games and the beginning of the Beijing Winter Games in 2022. So you're going to see a lot of Olympic activities kind of smashed into less than a year, actually.
Yeah, I've talked to some of those athletes. It really changed their training schedule and how they were about to ramp up. So it really did change a lot for them. What about, you know, the Olympics, the revenue, the advertising, all of this? How did this postponement affect all of that on the financial end?
It affected the USOC. We've cut the budget this year. We unfortunately had to lay off some staff and furlough some staff. You know, a good chunk of our revenues. A lot of Americans don't know this, but the U.S. is one of only maybe one or two teams in the world that do not get government backing. So all the support for the athletes and the coaches has to come from private sources. And that's what we do at the USOC Foundation. We raise money to support athletes, and then the USOC gets a lot of money from the TV network contracts. In this case, NBC, and so you know, we're working with NBC on trying to get some advances and, you know, trying to make the cash flows work, but not, you know, pushing the games a year has really, you know, put some financial strain on the USOC.
Yeah, that's tough. Guys, is this indefinite? Is this, until we get a vaccine, how long does all of this go on? What do you think? Mark, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, I think realistically, we're not back to packed stadiums, especially packed indoor stadiums, until at least there's some sort of antiviral therapeutic. I'll defer to Larry and Henry because they're trained physicians. But I think the vaccine is probably still a year away. Maybe we get lucky and it's sooner, but I think until we have either a therapeutic antiviral cocktail that can protect people at risk or a vaccine, I don't think we're going to be back to normal in the sports world.
Larry, I just saw that Disney was going to open Disneyland here in LA, and they've pushed it back, or, down in Orange County. They've pushed it back, so they don't feel quite safe yet. What do you think? How long does this go on where we're in this whatever we're in, whatever we want to call this?
Yeah, a mess. I think you have a couple of things going on. I think obviously the vaccine is a game changer, and I happen to agree with Mark's time frame based on calls that I'm on and things that I'm hearing. I think the other one potentially is some version of herd immunity. I mean, I think if you can start getting the population up to antibodies of a certain level, and I think you're typically kind of north of 65-70% rates of that. That's a game changer. I think the other thing, and the reason testing is so important, is I think you need to understand really how dire is it if one contracts the virus. And if you sort of look at the numbers now without a lot of testing, you sort of look at what Hopkins puts up, you sort of go, gee, nationally I've got a 4 or 5% mortality rate. That you can't return to normal with anything that's causing a 4 to 5% mortality rate. But if widespread testing shows that number to be a tenth of that, then you're dealing with a different set of facts. So I think you just need to know how widespread it is, who carries it, how's it transmitted, asymptomatic transmission, those sorts of things, which is being discussed a lot in the news right now. Until more is known about that, we're kind of in this in flux, in limbo as to what does normalcy look like in the world of sports.
And Henry, you're in Vietnam, and we were talking yesterday that you have 0 cases of community spread. Sports is back, and you're back with people in the stands. Can you what do you have? Under 400, fewer than 400 cases, right? Can you, do you think that could eventually be what goes on in the United States?
I think it's too difficult, quite honestly, because, the U.S. is much bigger. You have basically a federal system, so the states kind of can set their own rules. So you have, 50 sets of rules, basically. Whereas here in Vietnam, frankly, you have a unitary government that from the very beginning, and as I mentioned earlier, this is a place that goes through epidemics on a semi-regular basis. We still get what I'll call old school epidemics, like cholera or hand, foot, and mouth disease. So there is a muscle memory and practice to people's reaction to infectious diseases here. But in this case itself, the government was very, very forceful in its message of saying this is potentially much more dangerous and can have a much greater impact negatively to the economy, to public health. And obviously we're right next door to China. And with that kind of messaging and transparency, people here took it very, very seriously. And that's everything from social distancing, wearing masks out in public, stay-at-home orders, and even at a point where the government communicated to the country at large and said, hey, if we can gut out 3 to 4 weeks of absolute lockdown, right, we can knock out all of the community transmissibility of these cases. And people listened, and it happened. So it surprised a lot of people, but we've been back to life as normal here for almost 2 months. Kids are back in school. A lot of people are still probably working from home, but offices are open, malls are open, theaters are open. The professional soccer league here, in fact, had record fans. I think we've alluded that in terms of that pent-up demand. Our professional basketball league here will start up at the end of next month. So, we're trying to get back to life as normal, but it wasn't easy getting here.
People wearing masks and everything still when they're out and about?
No, now that there's been 0 cases, there's been a relaxation on masks. But frankly, the first 2-3 weeks back, public places, including office buildings, malls, they still requested people to wear masks. But now I think that's gone away because there's just been no cases of community spread. So, that gives us some assurance, but frankly, the borders are still closed. And it took like some pain and I'll say some real common drive to get that done. And it's not easy to manage once kind of, Pandora's box is flung open, if you will.
Which is what we have going on here. Pandora's
Yes.
box has been flung open. From one of the attendees, for Larry and others, how can we ever get herd immunity if we isolate every person, player, family, friend as soon as they test positive? To achieve herd immunity, don't we have to stop quarantining people who test positive? I don't know the science behind this, guys. Anybody?
I think the short answer is factually, yeah. I mean, if we actually isolated everybody 24/7, you couldn't get it. But the reality of it is in a country of 330 million people, where we value individual liberties, that's just not happening. So I think it will spread, and it will. But again, nobody knows sort of what the longevity of immunity is at this point, and so I think there's just too much that's unknown to answer that question sort of in a way that's helpful to anybody listening.
I look forward to seeing the leagues come back myself, because it's not just isolation. It's the loss of that drama of the, I like to call it a soap opera. Every league, every team has a soap opera, and you tune in and day out to see what the latest bit is. Let me see if I have any more questions. If Charlie wants to jump in. I think that we've talked a little bit about budget holes, I think, with the no fans in the stands. We talked a little bit about making up for that, and a little bit about the new normal, I think, that we're going to see. Larry, I heard that from the NFL that there'll be saliva tests for players, just daily saliva tests. And I know there are saliva tests, but can you get the results that quickly? And that we'll walk through sort of tunnels or things that are like metal detectors that take our temperature and tell us how we're doing. And that some leagues, I've heard this, Henry, that they have wearables that maybe can catch a fever sooner. Maybe Larry, you start with that, and maybe we can wrap up there.
Yeah, I think the league's exploring all of it. I think the NFL Players Association, the PA, has agreed to I believe that they have agreed to let their players be tested more frequently. I think the players want to be tested more frequently to sort of know what's going on. I know inside the stadium, or stadium operations folks are doing the equivalent of exploring CCTV, sort of closed circuit TV, like you'd see in places like London, that do facial recognition, but to do it for temperatures, so that without having to stop people at the gate, the technology apparently exists, that if you have people coming through a turnstile across 10 or 15 turnstiles, you literally can take temperatures and flag somebody who's running a fever on their way into the stadium. Again, though, I think the issue of the science is you have asymptomatic carriers, and what do you do about those people? So I think you've solved part of the problem, but it just leads to sort of what's the next level down of the problem you're trying to solve.
We have sports without fans. How do we engage them? Mark, you guys are going to be a big experiment. Can we have a great, tournament without fans and engage the fans from their homes?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, definitely. It's going to be a different experience, but we talked about earlier how the players are still going to be competitive, and it's still going to be a great product. And, the networks will figure out ways to make it seem like there's fans there of some sort. So no, I think it's, I'm kind of looking forward to it in a sense, to see how it all rolls out.
Yeah, I am too. A couple more questions. Henry, do you think Vietnam's success may also be due to the weather as a factor?
Yeah, no, there's no doubt that temperature plays in this sort of transmissibility, and that's why these things can be seasonal, whether it's influenza or coronavirus. But just going back to your question, I think even sports, maybe UFC has been a good example of being able to put on a great show without an audience. In fact, there will be subtle differences. I think Mark has alluded to, and Larry too, that we'll be able to hear things from the huddle, or how players talk to each other, to the refs, to the coaches, that I think can be actually quite engaging for a fan. And I've heard from, fighters who were in the UFC matches over the last several weeks talk about how they could actually hear the commentators and even pick up on where their weakness was, or where their opponent's weakness was, and even adjust. So, you're kind of living in this whole new world when it comes to sort of, you know, a different environment in which you're competing. And that's going to lead to, I think, things that maybe a trade-off to the energy of fans to, wow, you get to kind of have this inside baseball look of how all the players talk to each other, interact with each other potentially. So,
Liz, you may get the equivalent. I think we're coming up on the anniversary of one of McEnroe's big tirades against a chair umpire. So you may get a courtside seat literally to those kinds of engagements.
I think it was either yesterday or the day before that tirade. I aired part of that on one of my sportscasts. Have we talked about this from a labor point of view? Because we have a question about, none of you is an MLB owner at this point that we know of, right? Of course, but there was sort of this, they fought it out, the owners and the players, right? And the players stood their ground and the owners stood their ground. They made a contract, they made a deal in March. The owners wanted them to concede, but they did not. They wanted them to give up more money. I have heard things from players, Larry, but the NFL, if the NFL wasn't willing to allow players to take a stand and make a statement, well, then the players weren't going to show up and play. So there's possibilities in here, or voices in here that can cause a little bit of problem between ownership and players. What do you think about what went on with MLB? Larry, you can start.
Well, I think MLB has historically had a very strong players union. I think it's viewed as sort of one of the strongest players unions among the major sports leagues. I think when you look at the size of the unions, I mean, professional football has, I think, 1,800 players in its union who are actively playing. That's a lot of people to keep on message and in line. It's a little bit of herding sheep, because I think that the needs and demands of a 3-year player who's making a fraction of what a 15-year star quarterback is making are different. And I think and I think if you look at sort of the closeness of the vote in the collective bargaining agreement, it shows you that the NFLPA has different cohorts inside of it that have different needs. And I think, you know, given I think our collective bargaining agreement passed by, you know, percentage points. So I think trying to keep everybody in line around this issue is just, you know, I think the bigger the union, the harder it is to keep the whole body in line. And I think there will be natural divisions. So I would expect that, just like there were in the collective bargaining vote.
Henry or Mark, you want to add anything?
Well, I think baseball's had kind of a much more history of a contentious relationship between, you know, the players union and the league. And I think, you know, the NBA is a great model of how it's really turned more into a partnership. I think greater voice, greater say. I think both the NFL and even MLS, I think, have taken great strides to try to develop that type of environment in terms of making sure, you know, players are heard, and they also understand the economics of how we have to manage our business in a sustainable, successful way. So I think, you know, again, baseball, I think, has always been a little bit more contentious and different. And I'm thankful that we probably have more positive player and league relationships in our respective sports.
And Mark, you want to have the last word?
Yeah, I don't think this has helped baseball. You know, if you go way back in time, they had the steroid scandals and other you know, work stoppages in the 90s, and this sort of just for me personally, it's more the same for baseball. I don't think they've helped themselves in the last 2 or 3 months.
Gentlemen, I'd like to really thank you, and thank you for putting up with my little bit of you know, Wi-Fi problems. And it was great to be here with you today. And I love hearing from owners of teams who really can give us great perspective. Before we go though, Charlie, why don't you take over, and I'll just leave this with you.
Thank you so much, Liz. And special thanks also to Mark, Larry, and Henry for their amazing insight tonight. I, for one, cannot wait for sports to be back on television. Before we adjourn for the evening, I'd like to mention that all of our programming is made available to the public for free. So we would like to make an appeal for anybody to become a member at asiasociety.org/memberLA, or to make a donation at asiasociety.org/donatelA to support the programming that we've been doing throughout the pandemic. We'd also like to, again, thank our sponsors, TSM, and our special sponsor, the Peter Fetterman Gallery. We'd also like to thank again our sponsors for this evening, our silver sponsor TSM, as well as our special sponsor, the Peter Fetterman Gallery. We'd also like to thank our partners for this evening, the Asian Business League of Southern California, the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai, the Chinese Chamber of Commerce of Los Angeles, the Harvard Club of Southern California, the Japan America Society, the LA Sports Council, the UCLA Center for Management of Enterprise and Media, Entertainment and Sports, the USA Marshall School of Business IBR MBA program, as well as the USC Viterbi School of Engineering. Thank you again and good night.